History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. This observation, frequently attributed to Mark Twain, has never felt more chillingly relevant than it does today, on this day, 11th August 2025. When we look upon the haunting images emerging from the Gaza Strip, scenes of skeletal buildings, of mass displacement, of a people systematically squeezed into ever-shrinking enclaves of existence, it is difficult to ignore the disquieting echoes of a past we vowed would never be forgotten. The visual and rhetorical parallels between the policies enacted by Adolf Hitler's regime in the 1930s and early 1940s and the strategies employed under Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership in Israel are too stark to dismiss. This is not an exercise in equating individuals, but rather a solemn duty to recognize patterns of state-sanctioned oppression, lest we fail the most fundamental test of historical consciousness. The comparison is a deeply uncomfortable one, particularly given that the modern state of Israel was founded in the shadow of the Holocaust, built upon the promise of never again. Yet, it is precisely this promise that compels us to look closer. To ignore the structural similarities in the methodologies of control, dispossession, and dehumanization would be to betray the very memory of the victims of the past. It requires us to move beyond simplistic binaries and engage in a cautious analytical examination of how ideology, when fused with state power, can produce outcomes that rhyme with the darkest chapters of human history. The aim is not to draw a crude one-to-one equivalence, but to identify the warning signs that history has already taught us to recognize. This essay will carefully navigate this sensitive terrain. We will explore the ideological foundations and gradual escalation of Hitler's policies, from discriminatory laws to the establishment of ghettos. We will then analyze the political rise of Benjamin Netanyahu, the principles of his Likud party, and the relentless expansion of Israeli control over Palestinian territories. By juxtaposing the tactics of dehumanizing propaganda, the strategies of population displacement, the mechanics of the siege, and the role of military force, we can unveil the alarming structural parallels. The world's reaction, both then and now, offers another critical layer of comparison. Ultimately, this exploration is a call to vigilance. It is an argument that the lessons of the 1930s are not relics confined to museums but are living warnings for the present. The tragedy unfolding in Gaza, where over 61,000 people have been killed, is a contemporary crisis that demands our full attention. But by viewing it through the lens of historical precedent, we can better understand the mechanics of the catastrophe and the profound moral responsibility that falls upon the international community. To shy away from these parallels out of fear of controversy is to risk becoming the passive bystanders that history has already judged so harshly. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was not accompanied by the immediate construction of extermination camps. Rather, it was built upon a methodical and incremental architecture of oppression. The foundations were laid in ideology, specifically in the toxic belief in Aryan racial supremacy and the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. This doctrine posited that the German people were entitled to expand their territory, a goal that necessitated the removal of those deemed racially inferior, primarily the Jewish people. This was not a secret plan but was openly articulated in his writings and speeches, framing Jewish people not as citizens with different beliefs, but as an alien threat to the German nation's purity and destiny. The world listened, but it did not fully comprehend the literal intent behind the rhetoric. The escalation from words to deeds was chillingly systematic. The first steps were legal and social, designed to isolate and disenfranchise. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship, forbade intermarriage, and began the process of pushing them out of public life and the economy. This legal framework normalized discrimination, making it an official policy of the state. Each new decree, each act of public humiliation, was a test of domestic and international tolerance. The muted global response, characterized more by diplomatic hand-wringing than by decisive action, emboldened the Nazi regime, signaling that it could proceed with its agenda with minimal interference. The world was watching, but not acting. Following legal segregation came forced displacement and ghettoization. Jewish families were systematically evicted from their homes and herded into overcrowded sealed-off districts in cities like Warsaw and Lodz. These ghettos were instruments of control and slow-motion destruction. By severely restricting access to food, medicine, and sanitation, the Nazis engineered conditions of starvation and disease. This policy served a dual purpose. It physically contained the undesirable population while projecting an image of squalor and chaos that reinforced the dehumanizing propaganda that Jews were a source of pestilence. The ghetto was a waiting room for a more final, horrific solution. The world's failure to intervene during this critical period of escalation stands as one of history's greatest cautionary tales. Despite reports from journalists and diplomats, and the desperate pleas from Jewish organizations, the international community remained largely passive. There were conferences, like the one in Evian in 1938, where nations expressed sympathy for the plight of Jewish refugees, but ultimately refused to open their borders. This inaction was a green light for Hitler. It demonstrated that the world was not prepared to challenge his sovereign right to persecute a minority within his own borders, a lesson in the catastrophic consequences of indifference. To understand the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank, one must understand the political ideology that has dominated Israeli governance for much of the past 3 decades. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, is a product and a champion of the Likud party. The party's founding principles are rooted in revisionist Zionism, which historically advocated for Jewish sovereignty over the entirety of the land of historic Palestine, including what is now the occupied West Bank and Gaza. This vision, often referred to as Eretz Yisrael Hashlema or the whole land of Israel, fundamentally frames the Palestinian presence not as a question of a neighboring state, but as a demographic and security obstacle within the desired Jewish state. Under Netanyahu's long tenure, this ideology has been translated into concrete policy, most visibly through the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. These settlements are not merely suburban developments, they are strategic footholds designed to fracture Palestinian territory, making a contiguous and viable Palestinian state a geographical impossibility. Each new housing unit, each new access road built for settlers, is a deliberate step in cementing Israeli control and dispossessing Palestinians of their land. This policy, deemed illegal under international law, has continued unabated, often with the tacit or explicit support of powerful international allies, creating a reality on the ground that defies diplomatic solutions. The political rhetoric employed by Netanyahu and his allies has consistently reinforced this expansionist vision. Palestinians are frequently portrayed not as a people with national aspirations, but as a security threat to be managed or a demographic problem to be contained. Language that frames all Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, as being synonymous with Hamas, serves to justify collective punishment and delegitimize any form of Palestinian resistance or political expression. This narrative has been instrumental in securing domestic support for increasingly hardline military and legal measures, creating a political climate where actions once deemed extreme have become mainstream policy. This political context is crucial for understanding the events that have unfolded since late 2023. The war on Gaza, initiated in response to the Hamas attack, is being executed within a pre-existing ideological framework that views the territory and its people as an obstacle to a long-term vision. Statements from senior Israeli officials about human animals, calls for flattening Gaza, and the explicit goal of occupying parts of the Strip, as warned by Hamas in August 2025, are not just slips of the tongue in the heat of war. They are expressions of a deep-seated political project that has been decades in the making, a project where Palestinian rights and statehood are fundamentally incompatible with its goals. The path to atrocity is always paved with words. Before mass violence can occur, a group must first be stripped of its humanity in the public mind. The Nazi regime mastered this, portraying Jewish people as Untermensch, subhuman, through relentless propaganda. Led by Joseph Goebbels, they depicted Jews as parasites and threats, making persecution seem logical. Today, similar language appears in discourse about Palestinians. The context is different, but the function is alarmingly parallel. After the October 2023 Hamas attack, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called Palestinians human animals. Other officials have used biblical references and called for Gaza to be erased. This language frames an entire population as subhuman, justifying actions otherwise unthinkable. Palestinians are broadly labeled as terrorists, erasing the distinction between civilians and combatants. History will study this language carefully. Just as Untermensch was a prelude to atrocity, today's rhetoric enables catastrophe in Gaza.